It's been a couple days, but Super Bowl 58 is behind us. Shout out to the Kansas City Chiefs going back to back. First time, Amir, since we were even born, of course, in the early 2000s with Tom Brady and the crew. But today, we want to go through, we want to give out some playoff awards for this past postseason, but we also want to dive into this game. We want to talk about the penalties. We want to talk about the second half turnaround from the Chiefs, and of course, their glory of winning their back-to-back Super Bowls. And then, of course, we're going to dive into the GOAT debate. Is Patrick Mahomes close to Tom Brady? Amir, you're joining us here. How you doing on this Thursday morning?
I'm doing good, man. The season is over. I want to cry, but now it's the off season. Hopefully, the Browns. Hopefully, these teams can kind of get it back together, figure some stuff out.
Yeah, T. Higgins might be a Brown here if they don't pick up his tag. But,
Hopefully,
but of course, just recapping the season, you guys won't see the screen for, of course, about 6 to 7 months. But I closed off the year on an 8-game win streak. Amir, you took a little bit of a risk there. You kept betting against maybe the greatest player of all time, Patrick Mahomes. Regardless, on the season, you see our records at the bottom. I was 195 and 88. Amir, not too far behind at 187 and 96. Next year, we'll have a full slate on the podcast for you guys to watch. But a great season in the books, nonetheless. But let's get into it here. As if you guys didn't watch the Super Bowl, or again, it's been almost a week, I'm going to go through a quick recap of the game. So stick with me. And then, of course, after that, we'll splurge and tangent or go off into side tangents. But getting into it, starting off the game for the Chiefs and the 49ers, there were some early fumbles from both of their running backs. Of course, two guys that we said could be dark horse MVPs. Not really CMC as a dark horse, but still, you guys get the picture. It's a quarterback award. Christian McCaffrey and Isaiah Pacheco, two early fumbles for their teams in key situations that could have changed the game early on. And then we dive into the game a little bit. Of course, the Niners, I think, are up 2 scores at this point. And then Dre Greenlaw, of course, the most unfortunate thing of the evening, as he was going back onto the field after his offense, or regardless of what happened, he was trying to go back onto the field. And as he was planting off of his right leg, it looked like he tore his Achilles, and he was not able to continue playing in that game from the second quarter on. So very unfortunate events for Dre Greenlaw, and hopefully speedy recovery for one of the most underrated linebackers and defensive players in the entire NFL. But then Patrick Mahomes, they get the ball back, and they had a terrible interception. I think it was like a third down in their own territory,
yeah.
already down 2 scores. He rolls out to the right, and he throws it, and I think it was to MVS of all people. Regardless, it was picked off, and San Fran looked like they were going to dominate this game from start to finish. And overall, I would say at halftime, Amir, it was like 10-3. Two of the longest field goals in Super Bowl history, by the way. Of course, shout out to Jake Moody and Harrison Butker. But it was 10-3 at half, and it wasn't as close as the score said it was, because the Niners just dominated that entire first half, getting after Mahomes. And it really, again, like we talked about, reminded us of that Tampa Bay Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl. And then we get to the halftime show. Amir, and there's not much to mention here besides Usher and Alicia Keys.
Right.
We're reliving the past. Overall, though, I think it was a pretty mid halftime show. Amir, maybe you want to chime in later. Then coming out of the halftime show, the 49ers scored, going up 16-3. And of course, they were trying to go up 2 scores, but then Jake Moody missed the extra point. So 16-13, San Fran still in a pretty good spot.
That was a huge play.
A huge play. Yes. Jake Moody, of course, gave the Browns a win early in the season. Of course, we remember that as Browns fans. But then, some scoring went back and forth, and the next thing the Chiefs ended up driving, and they scored. Whether they were driving here, it was late in the game. It was 19-16 with 10 seconds left. And I will say that, the Chiefs had the ball, I think on the 10-yard line or something. There was 10 seconds left. And instead of, throwing a little under route to Rashee Rice, where he could have caught it and walked into the end zone on the last play of the game there, Amir, he threw it to Travis Kelce on a fade route. Rightfully so. That is your number one option. Travis Kelce couldn't come down with the catch. They had to settle for a field goal and go 19-19 into overtime, the only second overtime game in Super Bowl history. And then going into overtime, there was a huge holding call on third down to open up overtime for the San Francisco 49ers.
Yeah.
But then there was a huge catch and throw by Brock Purdy to Kyle Juszczyk, and they ended up driving down the field. San Fran got 3, going up 22-19. And then the Mahomes magic happened. They drive all the way down. They win the game. And, of course, they win it by using the same play as last year, corn dog. Or at least that's the coin term that they're calling the play. Little little fake motion back out to the flat for McCole Hardman. Of course, they picked him up at the midseason mark. Mahomes hits him just like last year to Kadarius Toney, and Chiefs go back to back. But Amir, after all that rambling, all of that game recap, I'm going to ask you this. I want your overall thoughts on this Super Bowl. I think it was overall one of the better ones we've had in our lifetime. Your overall thoughts about the game, and of course, dive into whatever you want to dive into.
Yeah, so going into this game, I mean, the biggest concern and worry was Brock Purdy. I look at Brock Purdy, look at the way he played. Personally, I thought he played great. I mean, even if you look at him the way he played compared to the other quarterbacks against his elite defense throughout the playoffs, I mean, he had a 70 QBR. I mean, Josh Allen had a 65, Lamar had a 40, Tua had a 15 QBR when they played the Chiefs defense. And, I think, if you were to look at the stats and, in hindsight and say, okay, so McCaffrey's going to rush for under 4 yards a carry, around 3.5. You would not think the game would have went in overtime. You thought KC probably would have went away with it. You thought they would have dominated, but I thought Purdy did a good job keeping them in the game. Now, the biggest concern that I had, and I thought was the most, disappointing fact for the Niners was the O-line. The O-line played terrible in the second half. Chris Jones single-handedly saved 3 different touchdowns that would have won them that game. And the Niners go ahead in overtime, drive down the field, can get 7, and then Chris Jones gets unblocked.
Yeah.
And then you go ahead and give Mahomes the ball back to go ahead and score. And I think, this game was both a combination of, one, Mahomes being great, but also San Fran is not doing their job.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's definitely, it's a questionable drive there. And I guess I'll ask you this. Do you believe that the Niners didn't know the rules, or do you think that's kind of just an immediate bailout that they could go with right after the Super Bowl? But because this rule has been in, not only for the playoffs, it's been a regular season rule for like the last 2 years or so. Do you buy into the fact that San Fran had no idea what the new overtime rules entailed?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is like, I mean, even if they didn't know the rules, all right, whatever. I mean, I can understand that. But I mean, at the same time, you should know the rules. So it's no excuse.
Right.
I mean, like, you're in the NFL, you have,
That's your job.
Exactly. It's your job. You have some of the smartest coaches, the smartest, analytic coaches, in the league. Man, if you don't figure it out, know the rules before you go into the game, especially playing against Patrick Mahomes out of all quarterbacks, you should know those rules. So it's no excuse.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like you mentioned there, of course, Brock Purdy, I think, had a really good game, and of course, I'm not the Brock Purdy fanatic fan like you might be, but I will say he did have a pretty good game. And if you really look at the tape, I think it was like 13-21. Amir, you probably have the numbers in front of you, but a lot of the incompletions for Brock Purdy were not really his fault. And of course, after Deebo Samuel went down again in the big time moments, that kind of it hurt this offense. They still have a lot of talent. Don't get me wrong. And I mean, for whatever reason, Kyle Shanahan went another game without trying to get George Kittle the ball whatsoever. But it really that did hurt the offense. And if you have Deebo Samuel out and you don't really choose to use George Kittle or Brandon Ayuk, it really kind of makes your dynamic offense one-dimensional. Yeah. And that was Christian McCaffrey. And Christian McCaffrey, one of the best players in football. So it's not easy to slow him down. But if the Chiefs only need to focus on Christian McCaffrey, I think it makes
Lights
the
out.
offense easier, more predictable is a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But Amir, you talked to me off the show here, and you wanted to talk about these penalties. And I was going to bring them up, and I was going to mention them here as the Chiefs had a history of being a heavily penalized team in the regular season. In the postseason, that was a different story. But your thoughts here about the refs here, and do you think that really changed the game here?
The thing is, I hate being those guys that's like, oh, so and so versus the refs. I hate being one of those guys, but I'm watching this game. I'm seeing, the first half. I'm seeing the Niners absolutely dominate Casey's O line, and I mentioned this last week. I'm like, coming into this game, the Chiefs have the number 1 penalized and number 3 penalized O lineman in the league, and so going into this game, I'm like, okay, these flags could potentially hurt them. They're going to hold a lot. They're going to jump off, false start a lot against his elite defense. And in the second half, I mean, I'm seeing Nick Bosa, Chase Young. I'm seeing all these dudes just get held.
Yes.
Time and time again. I mean, I'm seeing them fall out, get tackled, Mahomes rolling out, making big plays, and I'm like there is no way in every Super Bowl Mahomes has played, not one holding call has been called. I think that's a little weird.
Yeah, and again, I don't believe sports are rigged. Of course, last year we had that conversation when Arian Foster was messing with the world, and that people bought into it. And now, of course, everyone talks about this script, quote unquote. I don't believe sports, are rigged because you got, for example, on an NFL roster, just one NFL roster, and we're not talking about free agencies, we're not talking about the other 31 teams. You got 53 players, and you got another 15 to 18 on the practice squad. You got like 70 players, and then you got 30 coaches. So that's 100 different
Right.
people with 100 different stories, 100 different backstories on why they love the game of football, why they're doing it, different
Right.
reasons and motivations. Then you times that by 32, and then you add free agents, and then you add college players that never got a chance. It's just there's too much behind it to rig these NFL games. So
Yeah.
Mahomes, I don't think that these games are rigged. I will say that. However, like you mentioned, there's clear videos out there where there should have been 3 to 4, maybe even 5 holding calls on this Chiefs offensive line in that second half, and it just didn't happen. Shout out to Juwan Taylor. He did go to Florida, but outside of my fandom for that, he should have been called for multiple holdings.
Yeah.
But also, I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, Amir, and maybe your thoughts about it. As I have the same belief when it comes to the NBA, when it comes to foul baiting in the NBA, where I have it. Hey, you have, in the NFL, you have 4 different refs that are watching 4 different parts of the field, and again, 4 different personalities. So you're watching 22 of the 1% of the 1% of athletes in the world playing, at 100 miles an hour. All of them are trying to do some dirty underhanded tactics to get the edge on their opponents. So you have 22 guys doing all of that, and of course, this is the 1% of the 1% of athletes. And then you have 4 different refs that are supposed to always get the call right. It's hard because you have these guys going 100 miles an hour, and of course playing their absolute hardest. You can have one guy that's supposed to watch the back end of the field. What if he calls the game a little less aggressive than the guy controlling behind the offensive side of things? You have 4 to 6 different personalities from the ref side of things, and you got, of course, 22 great athletes on the field at all times. It's just, I'm going to play devil's advocate here in the NFL and the NBA. It's just extremely hard to be an NFL referee, even though it's a job that most people say they want. It's extremely hard to do it, and no matter what, you're always going to face backlash for any decision you make. So I'm going to play a little bit devil's advocate there and say that it's hard to be an NFL referee. So maybe some things like that you're just not thinking about. Like, hey, maybe
Yeah.
I should be calling a holding call here for the Kansas City Chiefs. Whatever though, right? But your thoughts here. Do you think that I don't want to say that's easy being an NFL referee, but I guess we can kind of transition here because we know the answer to that question. It's not easy being a referee,
Right.
but we saw the outcome of the game. And of course, you might have some stats here. I don't offhand, but basically, you guys have seen it if you've listened to any TV in the last week or so since Super Bowl 58. Do you believe Mahomes, of course, as of right now, he has similar, if not better stats than Tom Brady at this point in their careers? Do you think Mahomes is the GOAT for one? And then two, do you think he can pass Mahomes or pass Brady as of course he is on a historic run right now?
Okay, so for me, I don't like to use recency bias or jump the gun, and I also don't like to rank, active players based off of potential. I mean, because he still has a long way to go. And for me, when I'm looking at who's the best, I value longevity. Brady throughout 20 years won 7 rings. That's completely unheard of. And I'm looking at the accolades. The accolades are definitely a huge part to why it's a debate. But the stats for me don't really do much for me because Brady played in a different era of football. Like I know in 2002 when he first his first main year starting and being that guy. I mean, he led the league in passing TDs with 28. I mean, a completely different era that was mostly predicated based off of defense and running the football. This era Mahomes grew up in, I mean, it's completely different. I mean, it's airing it out, it's pass first. You spend less money on defense, and you're just pretty much just airing it out. And you even saw, this year when the Chiefs, made it the opposite. They put more money in the defense and sacrificed the offense. You saw his stats hit a crazy decline. Yes, he won it all, but I mean, it's just 2 different eras of football. So I don't really look at the stats as much, but I will say I think, in the long run, he will be better. I think so.
Yeah, I think, because people often forget, of course, Tom Brady, in 22 years of football, he won 7 rings. He was to 9 Super Bowls. And if you just look at the rings that he won in the 7, basically a third of his career, he was in the Super Bowl and winning it all. So, it's unprecedented that, how great he was for how long his career was. But I also want to throw out there that, hey, people forget Tom Brady went a 10-year stretch in the middle of his career in the prime of his, hypothetically his career and his football playing ability, where he didn't win a Super Bowl. And a large part of that
Exactly.
was, of course, due to Eli Manning. And I think Pat Mahomes might have a similar story here because
Yeah.
Andy Reid's not relatively young. Travis Kelce has been contemplating retirement. We don't even know if Chris Jones is going to come back. I know he said he will, but we've seen players multiple times before say they're going to come back at a parade and not come back, right? So this team could look drastically different next year. And of course, what if, let's say next year they complete this three-peat, Amir, something that hasn't been done, I don't think ever, right? Let's say they complete this three-peat, and then Travis Kelce goes off into the sunset with Taylor Swift. Let's say Andy Reid's like, you know what? I've cemented myself as maybe the greatest coach of all time. Let me hang it up, right? And then you have a situation where Mahomes is kind of by himself, where everything that he came into after taking over for Alex Smith is gone. And now it's just him by himself. And Brady, not that he had that same situation happen, but I think Mahomes might go through a stretch where, if maybe not 10 years, right? Maybe 4 to 5 years where he's not in the Super Bowl picture and he's only making it past, he can't make it past the second round of the playoffs, or he just simply can't get over the hump. I think Mahomes might have a similar story there, unless they can, of course, bridge this gap and get some younger talent in here that can, I guess take over the load for a guy like Travis Kelce and be that number one guy. But that's asking a lot. Travis Kelce might be the greatest at his position of all time. But I think Mahomes might have a
Yeah.
similar story to a guy like Tom Brady. But if you want my 2 cents, I agree with you. I think Mahomes,
Yeah.
just given his early success in his career, he is the only person that we've ever seen be this close to passing Tom Brady, and probably the closest we'll see someone in a very long time.
Yeah.
So I will say, off a talent perspective, probably the most talented quarterback ever already, just due
Yeah.
to evolution and the era that we play in. But when we talk about a career aspect wise, I think with the trajectory that he's on, I think Mahomes will end up getting at least 6 to 7 Super Bowls. So
Yeah.
but any last thoughts about the Super Bowl 58 here, Amir, before we dive into our 23-24 playoff awards?
No, but the one thing I do want to add to that, what you just mentioned, the thing about Brady too. I mean, those last 7 years he played, I mean, he won 4 out of 7 Super Bowls. So I mean, for Brady, that the longevity is an important factor. Very important. Mahomes still has a long way to go, but I mean, those last 7 years alone, I mean, Brady was dominant. So I give him that.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention here, even though I have it in the notes here at the bottom, the Chiefs are now a dynasty. So shout out to the Kansas City Chiefs with Patrick Mahomes, I'll say, because of course they won one with Len
Yeah,
Dawson back in Super Bowl IV. Amir, any clue who Super Bowl IV was against? I'll give you a clue.
it was
Their
against
primary
Green Bay,
color,
right?
Green Bay was Super Bowl I, and of course that was Bart Starr and the crew. Their primary color is in the logo here. It's the purple.
It was purple.
Purple NFC team in Super Bowl IV.
A purple NFC team in Super Bowl IV.
They're in the NFC North.
Do you mean tell me? Wait, they beat Minnesota in Super Bowl IV?
Yeah, Minnesota in Super Bowl IV, if my memory serves me right. And if my memory serves me right, it was I can't remember his name, but there was some running back for the Chiefs that would always just before Walter Payton would just always get those 1 yard carries when he would jump over the top. His last name was Kick. I could be completely wrong. I'll have to refresh my memory on that early Super Bowl success from the Chiefs. But 4 Super Bowls for the Chiefs now as they're climbing up the ranks here as far as team success on the biggest stage. But then we dive into our playoff awards. We have 6 different awards, and you guys will see them as we go on. And most obviously, we're going to start with the MVP. Amir, I'll let you have the floor here. Who's your MVP? And is there much explaining that we need to do here about the biggest award?
I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, it's Mahomes, and if you look at the way I prepped, this game was between Mahomes and McCaffrey. Whoever would have won or played better, I would have put them as the MVP, and I think they both had equal impacts on their teams. I thought Mahomes played flawless the entire playoffs. He did look human this past game, but I mean, he still got it done.
Yeah.
He still showed up when it mattered, and I thought McCaffrey, you know, put the Niners offense on his back and got them this far. So, this final game was kind of, for me pretty much saying, all right, whoever wins it, whoever outperforms the other is the MVP. And
Yeah.
Mahomes came up over top. So
Yeah, you touched on everything there. We touched on everything here just a few minutes ago. Patrick Mahomes, he was on a team that most people didn't have as their Super Bowl favorite, and all season long, this is a team that was doubted. And time again, this man proves he proves us all wrong, and he goes all the way to the playoffs, beats an explosive Dolphin offense, and then he beats a Bills team that people thought it was finally their year. us included. Well, actually, I think I picked the Chiefs. Regardless, and then he goes on to beat the Baltimore Ravens, the two-time MVP in Lamar Jackson goes on to the Super Bowl, beating maybe the
Who?
most complete team in football. We'll talk about Lamar here in a moment.
We need to.
If you really look at it, Amir, it's an incredible playoff run, beating the Dolphins, Bills,
Oh yeah,
Ravens,
yes,
and the 49ers. I think that might go
man.
under the radar.
That
That's a
is a
murderer's row.
crazy playoff run. And that's why this debate about Brady having elite defenses and getting carried by his defense. I hate that logic because I mean the Chiefs' defense, as good as Mahomes played, I mean the Chiefs' offense was not this high-powered, over-the-top offense like it was. Like they were really conservative, and the
Yeah,
defense, setting the offense up to dominate time of possession. I mean the defense played lights out the entire playoffs, and I think we need to give them a lot more credit.
yeah,
A lot more
absolutely.
credit.
But then we move over to the opposite side of the spectrum. Who was the least valuable player in the playoffs? I have a little funny one here because, of course, this is a non-serious award, and no disrespect to these players, you just didn't show up when the time mattered the most. Amir, who is your least valuable player in the totality of this year's playoffs?
You know, my least valuable player is Tua turned the ball over. This dude, I mean, the thing about Tua, I mean, we've had so many questions about him, and him being a game manager, and I think this playoff game just kind of proved that. I understand it was freezing cold. I understand, you're from Hawaii. You've been playing in Florida all year long, but I mean, it's no excuse for how bad he played. I mean, he didn't play good at all. He's the reason why the offense couldn't move the ball. The reason why they got completely shut down. And I think going into the next season, the Dolphins are going to have some questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think they already have some questions. Maybe
Yeah,
Tua's under contract for another year, so maybe you don't see any change. But like you mentioned there, maybe after next year, hey, maybe we want to move on. Maybe we want to go out there and grab the next quarterback out the draft, or maybe we have to go out there and trade for a disgruntled quarterback. Who knows? Maybe even they go out there this offseason and shock the world and get a guy like Justin Fields. Of course, I don't see that happening, but. Tua Tagovailoa, another year, another disappointing playoff run, and that's not only from Tua but the entire team
yeah.
aside from Tyreek Hill. Free Jalen Waddle, by the way. Hopefully, he comes to the Cleveland Browns for free. And I have a little bit of a joke here, right? But my least valuable player slash people, right, is Dan Campbell's analytics team, and
Yeah,
this could have just been Dan Campbell by himself,
we
but
got to talk about this.
it's I don't even think we really dove into it 2 weeks ago, but
We didn't.
it's really just it's crazy to think that if the Detroit Lions took one or two field goals, despite that amazing second half from San Fran, they could have been in the Super Bowl. And who knows? Detroit already beat the Kansas City Chiefs, and again, I know some injuries were involved, but that already happened. Maybe Detroit could be sitting here right now and being your Super Bowl 58 champions, given how they play the game of football, just like the San Francisco 49ers. But it's just the fact that Detroit had two or three opportunities in that game to really just go up an extra possession. And I know it's not that extra 6 points, 7 points that you want, but that three and then that six, it can add up over the span of the game. And
Yeah,
it's really crazy to think about the domino effect that one or two field goal calls from Dan Campbell, because they have a pretty good kicker, would have probably sent them to the Super Bowl. But regardless, we're here and things happen. And of course, that's the risk you take. But that's just kind of like the analytics debate, Amir, and we've
yeah.
had that on this channel before, I think, with Bakari. So I guess this is a good opportunity to get your thoughts on it. What are your thoughts? Do you think these teams should be heavily analytic based? Because I mean, hey, the analytics, say what you want, but it gives you a good reasoning behind making each decision. Hey, Tua, this just because he's on the screen. Tua throws, he completes 72% of his passes on the left side of the field, but on the right side, he only completes about, 65% of his passes. So, we should probably throw to the left side. It's like little things like that. Do you think analytics should be as huge, a huge part of the game like they are? Or do you think they should really just revert back to how football was and how we know it, where it's like, hey, let's just make the best decision in the time that we're in?
Yeah, so I have a love hate relationship with analytics. I think you have to have feel for a game. The Lions got this far, against arguably the best team in football against San Fran. They aren't playing the Buccaneers. They aren't playing the Rams. They're playing against the Niners. And the thing about me is when I'm watching the game, I didn't have a problem with them, going for it. Besides the 4th and 3 with 7.5 minutes left, and this is why analytics at that point has to go out the window. I mean, at that point, San
Has
Fran
to.
scores 20 straight points. Analytics is telling you, you have a higher chance of getting the fourth down. But it's like, I mean, you kick three right there. I mean, you go ahead and go up. You got
Yeah.
7.5 minutes left. Even if San Fran gets the ball back and score, you'll still get the ball back with 2 timeouts left, and you can easily win the game
Right.
and put it out. I think the fact that it got them there, and the fact that they were way too heavily analytic, they came back to haunt them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a shame, but again, I guess you live and you learn. I'm just hoping that I'm just hoping the Lions don't go through another drought. I hopefully they're back and they're better than ever next year,
I
because it's
think they
always
will
good to
be.
it's especially if they can go make a move or two. I think they need a receiver. Maybe they can go grab one in the draft. A lot of talented wideouts this year in the NFL draft. But then we get over to the rookie of the year in Amir. We talked about it. We could have went with the
Yeah.
we can include all the players that it was their first time in the playoffs, or we could just talk about strictly the first year actual NFL rookies. And we decided to go that route with the young guys here to show them some flowers, of course. And this one is fairly obvious as well. Of course, we could have went with the guy in the thumbnail, Puka Nakuya. We could have went with some other guys here around the league, but I think we both went with CJ Stroud, rightfully so, as
Yep.
he went into his first playoff game as a rookie, which is first off not easy to do for the fact that he even got a team that was 2-15 last year to the playoffs, and then they beat the best statistical defense in the first round of the playoffs by like 20 plus, hanging 40, what was it, 45 on the Browns?
Yeah.
Something insane, and that was without his second best receiver and a banged up tight end. So I think CJ Stroud just had an amazing playoffs, and he almost pulled out a second round win against the Baltimore Ravens, which would have been even a crazier run. But your thoughts here about CJ Stroud here in his first playoff, or I guess his playoff debut?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna go Puka here, but I mean, CJ won them the first game, so I think it was pretty obvious, pretty self-explanatory. Also, I thought he played well against Baltimore. I mean, he couldn't really do much. He was
Right.
getting pressured all game. Baltimore's defense, I think, is the best in the league. So, I thought CJ overall, played well in his playoff run.
Yeah. CJ Stroud, he's going to be a crazy guy, crazy just talent for the next 10 to 15 years at the bare minimum. And Amir, I'm not going to say anything, but I'm curious to see if we ever rank these quarterbacks where you're going to put this man CJ Stroud, if he's going to be on the higher or lower end of your spectrum. But I guess that'll be in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for
Yeah.
that there at home. Then we talk about the defensive player of the year slash, of course, of the last month or so. And who were you going to go with for this? Of course, a lot of different options. You can go maybe just for the impact in the biggest game of them all, or you can go for the impact just throughout the entirety of the playoffs, win or loss. But who is your defensive player of the playoffs, Amir, in your opinion?
So, for me, it was between two guys, Trent McDuffie and L'Jarius Sneed. And, I chose Trent McDuffie. I thought this final game put him over the top. I mean, he completely neutralized every receiver that lined up against. I mean, he completely took Debo out the game. Slot, outside, it didn't matter. And I thought that game alone put him over the top. I mean, if they don't have him, you know, I mean, Debo got 11 targets, only caught 3. Like, that's
Yeah.
absolutely insane.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I mean Brandon Ayuk was kind of obsolete too, so you can have an
Yeah.
argument for L'Jarius Sneed as well. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I had Trent McDuffie as my guy just because of how great he's played against guys like, of course, well Tyreek Hill's Tyreek Hill. He's gonna get the better of you eventually with his speed. Besides one big catch to Tyreek Hill, he was kind of held in check. Then
Yeah.
Stephon Diggs was kind of he was not really there for the Buffalo Bills. And then of course when you talk about the AFC Championship game against Zay Flowers, maybe Zay Flowers was the best performance against McDuffie this entire postseason run. But then even in the Super Bowl, where he played probably if Mahomes wasn't the guy, you could have made an argument that McDuffie deserved that Player of the Game award. But then mine is going to be Nick Bolton, a guy that I'm high on, even though he's from Mizzou. Of course, I'm a Gators fan, but Nick Bolton, I think he's just very underrated. And if it wasn't Trent McDuffie, to me, I'm going to go with the guy that led the entire playoffs in tackles, and of course, tackles for losses. And this is a guy that just was the anchor in the front seven of this defense that really played huge in that game against the San Francisco 49ers, where, of course, like you mentioned, Chris Jones had a huge impact in that game, but I think Nick Bolton also did as well. And if he comes up, I think he dropped 2 or 3 interceptions this postseason. So if he
Yeah.
catches all of those, of course, he could have been the runaway for this award, but he plays defense for a reason. As, of course, Bernie Kosar said way back in the day. But any extra players you want to throw out here, maybe you can throw out a guy like Drew Tranquil for the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah, Tranquil is extremely underrated.
Yeah, a guy
Extremely underrated.
who's elite off the edge there. And
Yeah,
of course, he was kind of unwanted this offseason, and now he's probably
yeah,
going to get a big bag. A guy like Dre Greenlaw before his injury, of
yep.
course. Nick Bosa, I mean, if he wasn't held every single play, he would have had a big postseason. There's a lot of guys. Aiden Hutchinson, I think, went under the radar,
Hmm.
before he got hurt, or not hurt, but before, of course, the analytics team stepped into the things. But there's a lot of guys you can mention here for
Yeah.
this award. Um,
The one thing I want to mention though, we need to start talking about Washington being DBU. I mean, they are just producing DBs. I mean, Trent McDuffie, Marcus Peters, Buda
yes,
Baker, Taylor Rapp, Byron Murphy. I mean, some actually legit guys. Like they are actually producing some great guys.
we're back here, and of course, a little intermission there. But I am too cheap to buy Zoom Plus, and I'm going to say that each and every episode it needs to be said. But we're back here with the coach of the playoffs, coach of the year, and Amir. Who did you go with for this award? A couple different options, I'd say, and I went with a little bit of a sleeper pick. But who is your coach of the playoffs?
Yeah, so I thought this could have went multiple ways. I mean, Dan Campbell, possibly, D'Amico, possibly, but for me, I love picking, opposite of the opposite, the obvious answer, but sometimes it's too obvious. I thought Andy Reid was the coach of the playoffs. I mean, you mean to tell me they go ahead, completely neutralize this Dolphins team, and then a team that was concerned offensively for the entire year gets to the playoffs and they're underdogs for 3 straight games and win
Or
every single
even
game, win every single game, in convincing fashion. That's absolutely crazy. So Andy Reid, in my opinion, deserves it more than anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think we now have to start talking about him as maybe the greatest coach of all time. I wouldn't go that far, but if he gets a three-peat next year, he's got
Man, if
an
they
argument.
three-peat,
Yeah.
man, if they three-peat, I might crash out.
So my coach of the year is going to be Matt LaFleur, because of course him and Jordan Love got that first ever 7 seed win. As a no, I think he is definitely a candidate, but I'm going to go with D'Amico Ryans, like you mentioned there. Just a guy that took a team that was 2-15 last year, like 2-15. Like really think about that, and then they won double-digit games this year, and then they destroyed maybe the best defensive football in the Cleveland Browns in the first round of the playoffs. It was just an amazing run. Of course, they were in the game against Baltimore, could have won it if a couple of things went their way. But I just think for the job that he's done with C.J. Stroud and just the overall group, and Will Anderson too, especially, I just think he deserves some recognition here. But D'Amico Ryan's Andy Reid, I think Andy Reid would have been my pick, like you mentioned there. It's the obvious pick, but it's the right pick, and sometimes 2 + 2 = 4. You don't have to overcomplicate it. Those are the coaches of the year, but a guy like you mentioned there, Dan Campbell, for getting that team there. Matt LaFleur, I think, for being simply, again, didn't have the greatest second round, but for simply, being the first ever 7 seed historically to win a playoff game and then be in the game with the 49ers. If Jordan Love doesn't, channel his inner Brett Favre with the Vikings, that team maybe pulls off an upset, with how the Green Bay looked that game. But of course, some other guys around the league also have an argument. But then I want to dive into the best performance, our last award here. And before we get into it, Amir, I want to look at some honorable mentions. And like we talked about before, Patrick Mahomes has an argument for his Super Bowl performance. Trent McDuffie has an argument for his Super Bowl performance. Nick Bolton. There's a lot of guys you can mention here. But for a single game performance, I wanted to throw in these three guys there because Baker Mayfield in the first round of the playoffs in the wild card, where he was doubted, and even though they were home, they were the underdogs, I believe, against the Philadelphia Eagles. But for him to come out and just have the energy and play almost perfect in that wild card round, 350 total yards, 3 touchdowns, and of course got a win over the reigning NFC champion Eagles. And honestly, the score did the Eagles justice, is a good way to put it. Then you talk about Lamar Jackson. I think in his first playoff game this year against the Houston Texans, a young promising team that just blew out a division opponent for the Ravens. He came out 250 total yards, 4 touchdowns, 2 on the air and 2 on the ground. And I think it was just kind of his MVP statement game where he's like, yeah, I'm the MVP of the league this year. And then another guy is Brandon Ayuk I wanted to mention. 3 receptions, 70 yards, and that game-changing catch that you just saw on your screen against the Lions there. And that ultimately, again, changed the game. Not to be cliche, against the Lions, and of course the Niners would have an amazing second half and win that game. Of course, Amir, there's a lot of other performances there. Amon Ra had a double-digit catch game. Travis Kelce's had a couple amazing games this offseason or this postseason. But any additional honorable mentions come to mind here before we get into our actual award winners?
Yeah, I mean that game Travis Kelce had against Baltimore. I mean, 11 targets, 11 receptions, no drops. I mean, playing absolutely absurd. I think that's an honorable mention. I think C.J. Stroud's game against Cleveland.
Yes,
Obviously,
yes.
I honorable mention that too. Personally, I think Fred Warner's game this past Super Bowl honorable mention. I mean, he had 13 tackles. He was running sideline to sideline, making plays. Anchoring that defense as well.
Yeah. But then we get into our actual winners of the award. And Amir, if you had to look at all the performances again, maybe some fandom comes into the way here for both of us, especially for me. But what do you think the best individual performance was in this postseason from a player that I guess who do you think had the best performance?
So, for me, I'm going to go with Puka here. I know some people might disagree, but for Baker, I mean, the Eagles' pass defense is already bad. We kind of already expected, Baker to somewhat be able to slice them up. I mean, if Lamar's the MVP. We kind of expected that, but I mean, Puka in his first playoff game, I mean, he single-handedly almost beat Detroit by himself. I'm sorry. I'm going to go ahead and say it. I mean, single-handedly, I mean, like when you're watching that game, you're like, dude, Puka might actually go for 200 yards and actually might carry this Lions team or carry this Rams team to the next round. And you go ahead and look at that last drive. It was an obvious holding and PI call. I mean, if they call that, Puka single-handedly, wins the Rams that game against Detroit. And I think that alone for it being his first game, for Cooper Kupp to be fully healthy and fully back, and for him to even outperform him, I thought that was the best performance.
Yeah, I think Puka definitely. I think 9 receptions, 180 yards are both rookie records in any playoff game, let alone your first playoff game. He's been amazing, and again, he came out of nowhere, fifth round pick out of Duke. That doesn't really scream superstar on
It
paper.
was
Or Yale rather, one of those Ivy League schools, right? But then we talk about mine, and again, you had some fandom in the way. I'm going to talk about some fandom here. I'm going to give it to Jordan Love, and like I talked about there, with the fact that he was the first ever 7 seed to win a playoff game, and not only did he do that, he did it against maybe the best version of this Cowboys team we've ever seen in the Dak Prescott era. I just think to go in there in your first playoff game to shake off any other doubters that there were, to put up almost 300 total yards and have 3 touchdowns, winning that game and putting up like 50 points on arguably a top 3 defense in the NFL. It was just an amazing performance. And of course, I've been a big advocate for Jordan Love since he was at Utah State. I thought he would have been the second best quarterback in that class. And maybe you can make the argument. Of course, I thought Burrow would be number one. Maybe you can make the argument that he has a better future ahead of him than guys like Justin Herbert or Jalen Hurts, or even a guy like Tua Tagovailoa. I want to go as far as saying he has a better future than a guy like Herbert or Jalen Hurts yet, but I definitely think he has the potential. But some other honorable mentions here, Amir, I want to throw out there. Romeo Dubs in that wild card game against the Cowboys, amazing game. Some other, offensive line love, if we want to give it out here. Penei Sewell and Taylor Decker had a couple amazing games there before they were eliminated. On the defensive side of the ball, we talked about it early in the episode. Dre Greenlaw and, of course, Drew
Yeah.
Tranquil, two guys that have played amazing all postseason, definitely deserve their flowers. But any additional guys you want to throw on this list? Of course, we can also throw in the obvious, Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl. But any additional thoughts here or any additional players you want to throw in here in this conversation?
I also, bring up, Nick Bosa, his 2 sacks against Detroit. That was huge. I mean, because if you don't get those 2 sacks in the first half, Detroit goes up by even more points, and that game is out of reach.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good one. Dre Greenlaw, like you mentioned, against Green Bay, well, he had 2 interceptions, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
He had 2 interceptions that
Game
game.
sealing one, too.
Exactly, another huge one. Nico Collins against the Browns, first
Yes.
round. I mean, he absolutely torched Greg Newsome, torched Martin Emerson. Was playing around with those guys as well.
Yeah, I think another guy that we can throw out there, if I can remember, I'm having a little bit of I just had it on top of my head, and it's just sometimes you forget those things. Matt Stafford is a guy that we can throw out there too for his wild card performance, and I think that's what it was. I'm going to show some fandom here and say Kareem Hunt for that 2 touchdown game in the wild card round, even though it's in disappointing fashion. But that is our last award here. Of course, we ran through 6 or so awards. And here is the recap, and I'll get our face cam here in the middle so it doesn't block off Amir's answers. But you see it here. Of course, Patrick Mahomes, you see all the awards we talked about. And of course, we also gave some honorable mentions. But Amir, that's going to do it here for today's episode. We ran through a lot of the Super Bowl coverage, the penalties, the GOAT conversation. We gave out 6 different playoff awards and about 50 honorable mentions. At least it felt like that. But any last thoughts here? As 12.7 thousand in the books, you have something big coming up for the channel. Hopefully, maybe I'm not gonna spoil it. Maybe something
Maybe,
else.
maybe, maybe,
You have
maybe.
something big coming up for us, and of course, we'll talk about that when the time is right. But any last thoughts before we get out of here? Episode 140 in the books.
No, man, that's a great. Guys, stay ready. We might have some, kind of, funner, more enjoyable videos. Kind of just like some great video ideas pretty soon. So yeah,
Yeah, next week maybe we'll go through the top 3 to 5 players at every position. I'm sure that'll stir up controversy to
a
say the
lot of
least.
controversy.
But that's gonna do it here. We'll see you guys next week, and of course, be on the lookout as of course we're dropping clips and everything on a daily basis. We're only going up, and of course, I promise you guys we're just getting started. But until next time, we're out of here.